slavery in the Bible.
All right, let's see it.
Working for others happened because there was poverty, and God didn't want there to be any poverty. Measures were put in place to protect people who had to actually work off debt. So if someone's family business tanked, like there was a crop failure, the only options were either to work for someone else or to die.
So those were never the only two options. Loans were always an option, although things got a lot more complicated after the 8th century BCE. Prior to that, Israel was primarily made up of subsistence farmers, and they diversified their crops, and if something failed, usually something else could step in. But if they fell on hard times, they could get survival loans from other members of the community that were interest-free, and people were just negotiating within their own community. With the increase in economic activity, complexity, expansion in the Northern Kingdom in the 8th century BCE, we switched to more of a command economy where urban centers are telling the farmers what to grow and are the ones offering the loans which are offered at interest and which are resulting in a lot more land consolidation, destitution, and debt slavery. And so when we get to the late 7th and into the 6th century BCE, when Deuteronomy is coming together, those are the circumstances that are being addressed by this imagining of the laws that God would have set almost 1,000 years prior, saying, oh, no interest, oh, debt slaves, you should give them money every 7th year when they go free. It's being very positivistic about the laws that God should have established when Israel began. Now, the problem is this was written in a period when Israel did not really have autonomy, did not really have control over their own economy, and so there's not really any data that indicate any of the laws in Deuteronomy, much less Leviticus, which is part of the holiness legislation written even later than that, were widely known, much less enforced. It's not until the middle of the 2nd century BCE, with the rise of the Hasmonean state, that we begin to see attempts to try to impose kind of an overarching, harmonizing legislative framework to bring it all together and say, here's how we could make these laws work. But by that time, the economy and the society had shifted significantly, and we're now in more of a Greco-Roman context.
Now, Israelites could work for other Israelites, or Israelites could buy servants from outside the other nation. And let me tell you, if there was ever a place to be a servant, it was going to be Israel compared to anywhere else. They were to be treated as a man hired from year to year and were not to be ruled over ruthlessly, treated as hired workers until their debts could be paid off.
So I don't know if this is intentional or out of ignorance, but this representation of Leviticus 25 is entirely glossing over a very clear and sharp distinction that is being drawn between how you are to treat native Israelites who are reduced to debt servitude versus how you may treat the people from foreign nations that you buy and reduce to chattel slavery. It explicitly says they are your property. You may enslave them forever. You will buy them from the nations around you or from the foreign nations and families that dwell among you, and you can pass them down as inheritance, and they will be your slaves forever. And then verse 46 ends by saying, however, the servants you get from the children of Israel, your brethren, you shall not treat them violently. So we've got a very sharp distinction between Israelite debt servitude and the chattel slavery of foreigners. And this presentation is entirely glossing over that distinction.
God gave them this rule. Every 7 years, all servants were released from servanthood. Even if they hadn't worked off everything they owe, they're free.
So 3 things here. The release in the 7th year only applied to Israelite debt servants. It did not apply to the foreign peoples who had been reduced to chattel slavery. 2, we don't really have any evidence that this release in the 7th year was ever enforced. Again, these are rhetorical texts, primarily serving literary functions that were written well after the fact. And 3, it depends on which law code you're looking at, because the covenant code in Exodus 21 says that only the men went free in the 7th year. It says if a man sells his daughter into sex slavery, she did not go free in the 7th year. Now Deuteronomy alters that and says your men and your women who are debt servants will go free in the 7th year. But that wasn't necessarily the best possible treatment you could get as an enslaved person. because we have the laws of Hammurabi from 1,000 years earlier and other law codes from Mesopotamia where you were released after 3 years of service. So in the 4th year, you went free. So Israel's treatment of debt servants is twice as harsh as it was 1,000 years prior in Mesopotamia. So it's a lot more complex than saying all slavery was like this, it was better to be a slave in Israel, this is what God wanted.
And get this, when you release them, don't send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as God has given to you, because remember, you were slaves in Egypt, and God saved you.
So here we're isolating a very unique passage in Deuteronomy that is nowhere hinted at anywhere in the legislation in Exodus and Leviticus that deals with debt servitude and how it comes to an end. And again, this is a passage written many centuries after the fact, and it is imagining what things should have been like when the nation of Israel was constituted. And again, we have absolutely no data that indicate these laws were widely known, much less enforced anywhere near the time period of its actual composition. It's not until centuries later that we see widespread knowledge of and enforcement of the legislation within the Hebrew Bible. And even then, the data indicate that a lot of the legislation was rationalized away or just outright ignored. Even the New Testament talks about how everybody is finding ways around what the law requires.
God's trying to get them back to the ideal, which is no slaves at all.
No such ideal is expressed in any way, shape, or form whatsoever in any syllable of the Bible whatsoever. That is a thoroughly post-biblical ideal that is being read back into the text as a part of this attempt to renegotiate our relationship with the Bible and find a God that would not support slavery in a text that unilaterally endorses slavery.
God said a lot to try and prevent them from even getting to that stage. He told them to support each other financially, to lend money without interest or profit. Poor people were freely given the ability to take crops from the edges of fields or pick the lingering fruit off of trees.
This imagines that slavery was a secondary state into which Israel fell, and that is simply false. The reality is that slavery was widespread and normative before the existence of Israel and for every single second of the existence of Israel that is represented in the Bible.
People have never been perfect, but God has always been trying to get us to go back to the ideal. And you can see the topic of slavery get better and better as Scripture progresses.
You see no such thing whatsoever if you try to plot the trajectory of conceptualizations of slavery within the Bible. What you're going to see is the biblical authors reflecting the social mores of the cultures that are influencing them, which is why the Covenant Code, the earliest legislation in the Hebrew Bible, is directly adapting the laws of Hammurabi. It's why Deuteronomy is reflecting Mesopotamian ideals. It's why the holiness legislation is reflecting more Persian ideals. It's why the Greco-Roman period Jewish literature and the New Testament are reflecting Greco-Roman period concepts of slavery. What you don't see in any syllable of any of the Bible is any concept of slavery as a practice being fundamentally wrong or evil. That is something that we would not realize until well after the Bible was completed.